Welcome to Echoes of Ihsan. Today, we're going on a deep dive into a really interesting concept from Islamic jurisprudence, the Mukatab. And we're going to be looking at this through the lens of Muwatta Imam Malik, Book 39, the Mukatab, which is really a foundational text when it comes to Islamic law.
Yeah, in this book, it really offers a lot of insight into the Mukatab system, a system that reflects the intersection of slavery, freedom, and Islamic values.
Yeah, for those who might not know, the term a mukatab is essentially a slave who has entered into a contract with their master to purchase their freedom.
Right.
This contract, which is called a kitaba, lays out the terms for their emancipation, including the payment amount and the time frame.
Right, and it's a fascinating concept because the Mukatab is kind of in this in-between space between slavery and freedom.
Yeah.
They're still technically a slave, but they have this agreement in place that sets them on a path toward liberation.
Right. They're in this transitional phase, you could say, working towards their autonomy.
Yeah.
And this in-between status brings up all sorts of interesting questions. Like, what happens if a mukatab dies before paying off their kitaba?
Right.
Can they own property? What about inheritance?
Yeah, all these are really, really important questions.
Yeah.
And Muwatta Imam Malik really provides like a detailed framework for addressing these complexities.
Yep.
And it goes into like the rights and the obligations of both the mukatab and the master, showing how Islamic law seeks to balance the different interests that are at play here.
Yeah, so let's dive into the text and unpack some of these details. The first part of the book, Judgment on the Mukatab, it sets the stage by establishing the fundamental legal status of the mukatab.
Yeah, the very first line is pretty clear. It says, a mukatab is a slave as long as any of his kitaba remains to be paid.
Wow.
And this statement, attributed to Abdullah ibn Umar, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, makes it very clear that until the kitaba is fulfilled, the mukatab is still legally a slave.
So even though the mukatab has this contract in place and is actively working towards their freedom, their legal status doesn't change until the very last payment is made.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
Yeah, this highlights the legal weight of the kitaba. It's not just some casual agreement. It's a binding contract with real consequences.
Yeah, and this view, it looks like it was shared among other early Islamic scholars as well. The book mentions other people like Urwa ibn Zubayr and Sulaiman ibn Yasar who shared this same opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really emphasizes how important this legal principle is. It wasn't just like one person's interpretation. This was a widely accepted understanding of what a mukatab's status is.
And that's really significant because it's like the foundation on which all the other rulings about the mukatab are built.
Exciting.
It provides that clear legal framework for navigating these complexities.
Now, this understanding of the mukatab's status as a slave until the kitaba is done has some big implications, especially when it comes to inheritance.
Right, because inheritance laws, a lot of times they depend on someone's legal status. And in the case of the mukatab, it gets a little more complicated.
Exactly. Like, what happens if a mukatab dies before paying off their kitaba? How do you divide their estate, especially if they have children that were born during that kitaba period?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, and Muwatta Imam Malik gives some insightful answers. It seems like Islamic inheritance law really tries to strike a balance between the rights of the master, the mukatab's heirs, and any outstanding debts.
So what does it say?
So according to Imam Malik, if a mukatab dies with outstanding payments and they have children, the master has the right to be paid from the estate first. Whatever is left after settling the kitaba, that's when the children can inherit.
So the master is kind of like a prioritized creditor in this case.
Exactly. The master's claim on the estate comes from that kitaba agreement
Yeah.
and takes precedence over other inheritors.
And that prioritization highlights the nature of the kitaba. It's not just a journey for the mukatab to be free, it's also a financial agreement between the mukatab and the master.
Exactly. And the Muwatta even provides a case from Mecca to show this principle. The book tells a story of al-Mutawakkil's son and his mukatab.
Okay.
So the mukatab passed away, leaving behind a daughter, outstanding debts, and enough property to cover both the debts and the kitaba.
Okay.
But the governor of Mecca at the time, he wasn't sure how to proceed, and so he wrote to the Caliph Abdullah Malik ibn Marwan for guidance.
Sounds like a tricky situation.
Yeah.
What did the caliph advise?
Well, Abdul Malik, known for his wisdom and understanding of Islamic law, laid out a very clear process.
Okay.
He said, first, settle any debts that are owed to other people. Then pay off the kitaba, and then finally, whatever is left over, you divide it between the daughter and the master.
So it's a very methodical approach.
Exactly.
So-
It demonstrates this careful consideration that's given to each claim on the mukatab's estate. It's not just a random dividing of assets. There's a clear hierarchy based on their legal obligations and familial ties. Absolutely. And this case really highlights how Islamic law tried to address even the most complex scenarios to ensure that things are fair and that the rights of all parties are upheld.
Now, all this talk about the kitabah and the master's rights brings up an important question. Is the master obligated to give a kitabah if a slave requests it? Or can they just say no?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the core of the relationship between a master and a slave in Islamic society.
Because the kitabah offers this path to freedom, but it's ultimately the master who decides whether or not to grant it in the first place.
Exactly, and this is where we see this nuanced interplay between legal obligations and moral considerations. Imam Malik's opinion, based on his understanding of Islam, is that a master is not legally required to give a kitabah.
So it's not like a guaranteed, right? It depends on the master's willingness.
Exactly. Imam Malik argues that while the Quran encourages freeing slaves and giving kitabahs, it doesn't command it in every situation. And he cites several verses in the Quran to support this.
Oh, okay. Can you give us an example?
Yeah, sure. He points to verses that highlight things that are good to do but not mandatory, like hunting after the pilgrimage or seeking Allah's favor after prayers. And he argues that giving kitabah kind of falls into that category.
So even though the Quran explicitly says, and such of your slaves as seek a writing of emancipation, give them such writing if you know any good in them, it's not like legally a right.
Right, and this is where the concept of Ihsan comes in, doing what is good and beautiful, going above and beyond what's just required. While granting a kitabah might not be legally mandatory in every case, it's definitely seen as a really virtuous act.
So it's like the Quran is appealing to the master's conscience, encouraging them to act with compassion and give freedom when they can.
Yeah, and the book actually gives us a great example of this in action.
Okay.
It mentions Abdullah ibn Umar, a follower of Ihsan, granted a kitabah for 35,000 dirhams and then reduced it by 5,000 dirhams as an act of charity.
Wow.
And this reduction was not legally required, it was purely voluntary.
That really shows a lot about Abdullah ibn Umar's character.
It does.
And the values that he held. It also shows how the kitabah system, even though it's grounded in these legal contracts, could also be an opportunity for compassion and ethical behavior.
Absolutely. It serves as a reminder that even within a system that has power imbalances, there's room for people to make moral choices.
It's a powerful testament to human goodness, even in these challenging circumstances.
Now let's move on to another interesting aspect. What happens to the Mukatab's property once they get their kitabah?
Yeah, because that really gets to the heart of ownership and what it means to go from slavery to freedom.
Right.
What does it say?
The Muwatta Imam Malik is very clear about this. It says, when a master gives a kitabah, the Mukatab's property goes with them, but their children stay the property of the master unless it's specifically stated in the kitabah.
So there's a distinction between the Mukatab's own possessions
Yeah.
and their children.
Right.
So like their own personal items that they acquired themselves.
Yes.
Those they take with them. But the children born while they were a slave belong to the master.
Unless specific arrangements are made.
Unless specific arrangements are made.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right. This really emphasizes the complexities of ownership,
Mm-hmm.
The Mukatab gains control over their own stuff, but their children's status is still tied to the master.
Yeah, and this likely reflects social norms and economic realities of the time. Children born into slavery were often seen as belonging to the master, and even though that might seem strange to us today, it was just how things were at the time.
Absolutely. And to further illustrate this, the book talks about a pregnant slave girl who's owned by a Mukatab.
Okay.
And it says that if the Mukatab is granted their kitabah and neither of them knew about the pregnancy, the child still belongs to the master.
So even if they didn't know
Even if they didn't know.
that the slave girl was pregnant, that your child would still belong to the master.
To the master, yeah.
Okay, so that shows the level of detail that Islamic law went into, to define the boundaries of ownership.
Absolutely. This case shows how Islamic jurists were trying to think of every possible scenario and make sure the law addressed those situations.
Yeah, it's clear that Islamic law, as shown in the Muwatta, tried to create this comprehensive framework for dealing with all the complexities of the Mukatab system.
Yeah.
Balancing the rights and obligations of both the master and the Mukatab, while also addressing inheritance, property ownership, and even, like you said, unborn children.
Absolutely. And as we go through this book, we'll uncover even more fascinating details and get a better understanding of how this system functioned within Islamic society and its values.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see what else we find. But before we move on, let's take a minute to just think about what we've already learned about this Mukatab system.
Yeah, it's been a journey already.
Yeah.
We've seen how the Mukatab occupies this unique space between slavery and freedom.
Hmm.
They're bound by this contract that will set them free, but they're still under the authority of their master
Right.
until that contract is fulfilled.
And we've seen how Islamic law tries to deal with these really complicated things like inheritance and
Mhm.
property ownership,
Right.
and even the status of children.
Yes, and these rulings, they might be unfamiliar to us today.
Yeah.
They offer us a window into a different time and a different set of social norms.
Yeah, and they highlight the efforts of Islamic scholars to really try and address the nuances of this unique social arrangement.
Exactly. And as we continue our exploration, we'll dig even deeper into these nuances.
Okay.
We'll uncover the details of the Kitaba contract,
Yeah.
the responsibilities and the limits placed on the Mukatab and the master, and
Hmm.
all the various things that can happen during this transition to freedom.
Okay, great. I'm ready.
All right.
Let's do it.
So we've been talking about the legal status of the Mukatab and how Islamic law addresses some of those complexities related to inheritance and property ownership.
It's really fascinating to see how the Muwatta gives such a detailed framework for navigating these situations,
Mm-hmm.
showcasing this deep concern for fairness and addressing all these different contingencies.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's look at a section that introduces kind of a new layer of flexibility within the system. It's called Severance in the Kitaba for an Agreed Price.
Okay.
And it explores the possibility of settling the Kitaba for a predetermined amount even before all those installments are paid.
Oh, that's interesting. So like an early settlement.
Oh, exactly.
So it wasn't always this rigid, fixed term arrangement.
Right.
There was room for negotiation and the possibility of getting freedom sooner.
Exactly. And the book actually gives an example of this from the early days of Islam. It mentions that Salama, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad,
Oh, wow.
made this kind of arrangement with her own mukatab, settling for a fixed amount of gold and silver.
That's really interesting. So this practice goes back to the very beginning of the
Yeah.
Muslim community.
Absolutely. It shows that early Muslims were already trying to find ways to make the kitaba system more flexible and
Yeah.
more compassionate within the framework of Islamic law.
And it also shows that women played a big role in Islamic society,
Yeah.
even in matters of finance and legal agreements.
Absolutely.
So Salama wasn't just a bystander.
Right.
She was actively involved in shaping those practices.
Exactly. Now, when it comes to mukatabs that are owned by multiple partners, the concept of early settlement, it gets a little more tricky. Imam Malik says that one partner can't just decide to settle the kitaba for their portion
Right.
without getting consent from the other partners.
It wouldn't be fair for one partner to make a decision
Right.
that could affect the others.
Exactly. The idea of mutual consent is really important in these cases.
Yeah.
It shows this deep respect for the rights and interests of everyone involved.
It's all about fairness and transparency.
Absolutely.
It's not just about individual gain, but about a system of shared responsibility.
Exactly. Now, let's say, for example, one partner does settle their portion of the kitaba without consent, and then the mukatab dies or can't pay. What happens then?
Yeah, that sounds like it could get messy.
It does. According to Imam Malik, in that scenario, the partner who settled without consent wouldn't have any claim on the mukatab's property,
Yeah.
and they also wouldn't be able to get their money back. Essentially, their actions are seen as invalid.
So there are consequences
There are.
for not following the rules.
Absolutely. It's a clear message that the system demands integrity and
Mhm.
respect for the agreed upon terms.
Now, what if a mukatab is jointly owned and one partner settles with consent, but then the mukatab can't pay the rest?
Yeah, this is a different challenge. Imam Malik says ideally the partner who settled should return what they received to their partner
Okay.
so that the mukatab stays jointly owned.
So they're trying to keep the original ownership
Right.
as much as possible.
Exactly. It's about keeping things fair
Yeah.
and not giving one partner an advantage over the other.
And what if the mukatab dies in this situation?
In that case, Imam Malik says the partner who didn't settle gets their kitaba paid in full from the estate.
Okay.
And then what's left of the property is divided between both partners based on their original shares.
So even in death, the financial arrangements are handled fairly.
Exactly. It's about having a system that can handle these different things that can happen while still upholding the core principles of fairness and agreement.
These rulings, they show how much thought went into this legal framework. you know?
Yeah.
It's trying to balance upholding the contracts while also considering the challenges of real life.
Absolutely. And this section shows how dynamic the system really is and
Yeah.
how adaptable it was designed to be.
Now, I'm curious to see what the next section is all about. It's called Injuries Caused by Mukatabs,
Yeah,
which sounds a little intense.
it is. This section explores what happens when a mukatab causes harm to someone else and has to pay blood money.
Okay, now things are getting interesting. So let's say a mukatab injures someone, and there's a blood money payment required. What are the options?
Well, Imam Malik lays out a few different scenarios. If the mukatab can pay the blood money with their kataba funds, then that's what they do.
Okay.
The payment is taken from their kataba amount.
Got it.
So it reduces how much they still owe to the master.
So in a way, their path to freedom becomes a way to make up for the harm they caused.
That's one way to look at it. It shows how interconnected things are for a mukatab.
Yeah.
Their freedom, their money, and their responsibility for their actions.
Yeah, it's a reminder that they might be on a path to freedom, but they're not free from the consequences of their actions.
Exactly. Now, what if the mukatab can't afford to pay from their kitaba funds?
Then who's responsible? Does the master have to pay?
You got it.
Huh.
In this case, the master has two options. They can either pay the blood money themselves and keep the mukatab as a slave, or they can surrender the mukatab to the injured person.
Oh, wow. So it's a big decision for the master.
It is.
Do they pay or do they give up their mukatab?
Exactly. And it shows how complex the master-slave relationship is, even with this kataba agreement.
Yeah, it's not just about money. It's about people's lives.
Right.
The balance between ownership and responsibility.
These legal rulings really had a big impact on people's lives,
Mhm.
affecting their finances, their freedom, and their relationships.
Now, what happens if there are multiple mukatabs in a joint kitaba and one of them causes an injury?
Imam Malik says that all the mukatabs in the joint kitaba are responsible for paying the blood money.
So it's just a shared burden.
It is just like the kataba payments themselves.
They're not just together in their pursuit of freedom,
Right.
but also in their responsibilities.
Exactly. It emphasizes that collective responsibility,
Yeah.
that their fates are connected,
Oh.
and they share the results of each other's actions, good or bad.
Now, things get even more interesting when we think about a mukatab who is injured themselves. How do you calculate the blood money then?
This is where that in-between status comes in again.
Okay.
Imam Malik says the blood money for an injured mukatab is calculated based on their value as a slave, not as a free person.
So even though they're working toward freedom, they're still legally a slave.
Exactly. And this amount is paid to the master,
Okay.
and the master takes it off of the mukatab's remaining kataba payments.
Interesting. So their injury reduces their debt.
Exactly. It's like the kataba system touches every part of the mukatab's life.
Yeah.
Their money, their relationships, even their injuries.
So let's say the blood money is like a third of their kataba amount. Does that mean their kataba is reduced by a third?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
The Muwatta gives an example. It says if a mukatab has a 3,000 dirham kataba and their blood money is 1,000 dirhams, they only have to pay 2,000 more to be free.
It's like a balance sheet.
Yeah.
Their injury is weighed against their debt.
It shows the careful calculations involved in these rulings.
And what if the blood money is more than what they owe on their kitaba?
In that case, Imam Malik says the master takes the remaining kataba amount and frees the mukatab.
Okay.
And whatever is left over from the blood money goes to the mukatab themselves.
So they actually get a financial benefit,
Yeah.
even though they're injured.
Exactly. It's like the system recognizes they've suffered and deserve some compensation.
It's a reminder that even with these power imbalances, there are attempts to be fair and protect the vulnerable.
Right. This section really shows how complex the system is,
Yeah.
how it dealt with injury money and the pursuit of freedom.
Now I'm ready for something a little lighter. What's next?
All right, let's move on to the part about selling mukatabs.
Selling mukatabs. That sounds complicated,
It can be.
especially considering their unique status.
Right. The Muwatta talks about the rules around this practice, and it reveals a lot about how Islamic law tried to balance ownership rights with the mukatab's path to freedom.
Okay, so what are the rules?
Mm.
Can a master just sell a mukatab to anyone whenever they want?
It's not quite that simple. Imam Malik says that if the kitaba was written for a certain amount of dinars or dirhams, the master can't sell the mukatab for a delayed payment.
Okay.
The payment has to be immediate.
Why is that?
It's about this principle in Islamic finance about not having debt for debt.
Okay.
Basically, selling the mukatab for a delayed payment would create a new debt while the old one is still outstanding.
Okay, I see.
And that could lead to problems. It's
Yeah.
like it's trying to protect against making it harder. or the mukatab to become free.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Islamic law really emphasizes being clear and avoiding too much risk in financial matters.
Yeah.
So this rule about not delaying payment is part of that.
It's amazing how these financial principles are part of the Kitaba system.
Right. They shape the whole transaction and
Yeah.
protect both the master and the mukatab.
Now, are there cases where you could use something other than money to buy mukataba?
Yes. If the kitaba was initially for things like camels or other livestock or even other slaves, the sale can happen with those, but the payment has to be immediate, and it can't be the same kind of goods used in the original kitaba.
So there are rules about what you can use as payment.
Yes, it's all about being clear and avoiding confusion or manipulation.
It's all about fairness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to make sure everything's fair, there's something called the right of preemption.
Oh, that sounds interesting. What is that?
So if the mukatab can afford to pay the price they're being sold for, they have the right to buy themselves back from the buyer.
Oh, wow.
They can basically reclaim their freedom.
That's amazing.
Hmm.
So even though they're being sold, they have some control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It acknowledges their desire for freedom and their right to try and get it.
So it's not entirely powerless.
Not at all. It's a reminder that even though they're owned, they have some rights and protections.
But what if only part of the mukatab is being sold, like half or a third? Do they still have that right?
That's a good question. In those cases, no, they don't. It's more like when a partner sells their share of a business.
So buying a part of themselves doesn't make them free.
Right. And it might even make it harder to
Yeah.
pay off the rest of their kitaba.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's about protecting their long-term interests.
Yeah.
And making sure the system works.
These rules are so intricate. It's amazing how they try to balance the rights of the owner and the mukatab's path to freedom.
It really is a balancing act.
Now, I'm really curious to learn about the actual work involved in becoming free.
Right.
What was it like for the mukatab to earn their freedom?
That's a great transition. The next section is about the labor of mukatabs.
Okay.
It explores the types of work they did, their rights and obligations,
Okay.
and how their work helped them gain freedom.
This is going to give us some real insight into their daily lives.
It will. We're going to move beyond the laws
Yeah.
and look at the human side of this system.
Ready? Let's keep going.
Let's do it. So we've talked about inheritance, property ownership, selling a mukatab, and all the complexities of injuries and blood money payments.
It's been fascinating to see how Islamic law really tries to address all the different angles. You know, this concern for fairness and detail and recognizing the humanity of the mukatab.
Right. And now we're going to get to the heart of their experience, their labor.
Okay.
The section on the labor of mukatabs looks at the work they were expected to do, their rights, their obligations, and how their work led to their freedom.
This is where we get to see what their daily lives were really like.
Exactly. We're going to move past the abstract legal stuff and see the human side of things.
One question I have is, what happened to the children of a mukatab who died before finishing their kitaba? Did they have to work off the rest of their father's kitaba or even become slaves?
That's a tough question, and it shows how this system could potentially trap people for generations. The answer, like a lot of things in Islamic law, depends on a few things. Mainly the children's age, if they can work, and if the mukatab left any money to cover what they still owed.
So let's say the kids are too young to work. What happens then?
If the mukatab didn't leave enough money and the kids are too young to work, they unfortunately go back to being slaves of the master.
Oh, wow.
But there is a bit of hope here. If the mukatab left enough to cover the payments until the kids are old enough to work, then that money is used to keep them free until then.
So it's not an automatic sentence to slavery?
Yeah.
There's some time if the mukatab planned ahead.
Right. It shows some compassion in the system, recognizing that kids are vulnerable and trying to protect them from becoming slaves right away.
Okay. And once those children are old enough to work, can they earn their freedom by paying off the rest of the kitaba?
Yes, that's exactly the chance they get. Once they're old enough to work, they can choose to take on the responsibility of their father's kitaba. If they can pay it off through their work, then they're free.
And if they can't?
If they can't, they become slaves to the master.
It's a tough system, but at least there's a possibility for them to escape slavery.
Right. It acknowledges that even people born into tough situations can have a chance to improve their lives.
This section also talks about the wallet. Can you remind us who that is and how they're involved here?
Sure. And Walid is a slave woman who has had a child with her master.
Okay.
And because of that, she has certain rights in Islamic law, like the right to not be sold and the right to freedom when her master dies.
So in this case, with the deceased mukatab and their children, what role does the wallet play?
If the Mukatab had an walad and she's able to work and willing to pay off the kitabah for herself and the children, she can do that.
So she becomes a protector for those kids,
Yeah, exactly.
using her own labor to try and win their freedom.
It really shows the strength of women, even in a system like slavery.
It's also interesting that she has a choice in this.
Right.
It's not an obligation.
Exactly. It shows that even within a system that limits their options, women still had some agency.
There's another interesting point here about mukatabs working together.
Yes.
If there was a group who entered a joint kitabah and some couldn't contribute, those who worked to free themselves could later ask for compensation from those who couldn't.
It's an interesting detail, right? It shows that even within this system, there's an idea of fairness and balancing out the effort and support.
It's not just about individual freedom, it's about the group supporting each other.
Right. It highlights the importance of helping each other and the understanding that freedom isn't always something you achieve alone.
Now I'm curious about what else the Muwatta has to say. What's next?
Okay, let's move on to a part that focuses on early emancipation. It's called freeing a mukatab if he pays what he owes before the end of the term.
Early emancipation. That sounds good.
Yeah.
So they don't have to wait until the very end of their kitabah to be free.
Exactly. If they can get the money to pay off the whole kitabah early, they have the right to do that, and the master can't say no.
So they earn their freedom. It's not just given to them by the master.
Right. The mukatab is in control of their own liberation.
Yeah, they're not just waiting for the master to be kind. They can take charge and use their own efforts to speed up the process.
The book even tells a story about a mukatab owned by Al-Furafisa ibn Umar al-Hanafi.
Okay.
This mukatab wanted to pay off his kitabah early, but Al-Furafisa refused to take the money.
Why would he do that? It seems strange to refuse money you're owed.
It does make you wonder about the reasons. Maybe some masters valued their mukatab's work or even their company and didn't want to let them go.
So it wasn't just about the money.
Right. It reminds us that the relationship between a master and a mukatab could be complicated.
What happened in the story?
Well, the mukatab went to the governor of Medina, Marwan ibn al-Hakam,
Okay.
and he sided with the mukatab and made Al-Furafisa accept the payment and set him free.
So it was a victory for the mukatab. It shows that even in those days, there were ways to fight for your rights.
It also shows that the kitabah was really about the mukatab becoming their own person, not about the master holding on to them.
Right. The freedom had to be earned.
Exactly. There's even another case mentioned about a mukatab who was terminally ill,
Oh, wow.
and he paid off his kitabah early so that his family could inherit from him.
So it wasn't just about his own freedom, but also about providing for his family.
Right. It shows how important freedom was for them, not just for themselves, but for their loved ones.
This brings up the question of inheritance. What happens to a freed mukatab's estate after they die? Who were their heirs?
Good question.
Ah.
And that's covered in the section called The Inheritance of a Mukatab when he is set free.
Okay.
It talks about the rules for inheritance for those who were once mukatabs but are now free.
It's interesting how even after they're free, their past as a mukatab still affects things.
Right. The rules are different for them compared to people who were never slaves.
So who gets to inherit from them? Their family, or does their former master still have a claim?
According to Imam Malik, the main inheritors are the people who wrote the kitabah and their descendants.
So even after freedom, there's still this connection between the mukatab and their former master's family.
Right. It's like a lasting bond, a form of kinship that comes from the kitabah.
I wonder what those relationships were like in reality beyond just the legal obligations.
Yeah, it would be interesting to find out if there was also social support or even friendship between them.
The book gives an example of a jointly owned mukatab where one owner freed their share, but the other didn't.
Okay.
When that mukatab died, the owner who hadn't freed their share got paid from the inheritance, and then what was left was split between both owners.
So even though only one owner had freed their portion, both got a share of the inheritance.
It's another example of how even a partially completed kitabah had lasting effects.
Exactly. It shows how complex joint ownership could be.
Now let's talk about this section on conditions concerning mukatabs. It seems like even with a kitabah, there could be limits on a mukatab's freedom.
Yes. This part shows how the kitabah could be used not just to give freedom, but also to maintain some control.
What kind of conditions are we talking about?
Things like not being allowed to travel, restrictions on marriage, or having to keep serving the master even after the kitabah was paid.
It doesn't sound very free if they still have all those restrictions.
Right. It shows the tension between the promise of freedom and the reality of these limitations.
Freedom isn't always simple or absolute.
Exactly.
It's more complicated than that.
And for mukatabs, freedom was often a process, a gradual thing with conditions.
Could the master just cancel the kitabah if the mukatab didn't follow these conditions?
No, Imam Malik says they couldn't use those conditions to cancel the kitabah, but the mukatab was still expected to follow them.
So it's more like a moral obligation.
Yes.
They should honor those conditions even though there might not be legal consequences.
Exactly. It shows how the kitabah wasn't just a legal document.
Yeah.
It existed within a whole system of social expectations.
It's a reminder that even with the kitabah, they weren't completely autonomous. There were still limits set by the master.
It shows the power dynamics of that time.
Now let's move on to the concept of wala.
Okay.
The section, the wala of the mukatab when he is set free, explains how it applies to a freed mukatab.
Wala is basically the right of patronage and inheritance that comes with freeing a slave.
Okay.
But with a mukatab, it's more complicated because they're not fully free until they finish paying their kitabah.
So how does wala work with a mukatab? Does their master get wala over them right away?
It's not that simple. Imam Malik says the master has a kind of wala over the mukatab during the kitabah,
Okay.
but it doesn't fully transfer until the mukatab pays everything and is completely free.
So it's different from the wala over a regular slave.
Yes. With a regular slave, it's more immediate and complete.
Okay.
With a mukatab, it's limited and depends on them finishing the kitabah.
Can you give an example of how that works?
Sure. Let's say a mukatab owns a slave. If they want to free that slave, they need their master's permission.
So even though they're on their way to freedom, they still have to answer to their master.
Exactly. Now, if the master gives permission and the mukatab frees their slave, the wala of that freed slave goes to the mukatab. But if the mukatab dies before paying off their own kitabah, that wala goes back to the master.
Wow, that's complicated.
It is.
It's like the wala's on hold
Yes.
until the mukatab is truly free.
It shows how connected everyone is in this system.
Okay, now what happens if the freed slave dies before the mukatab is fully free?
Then the mukatab's master inherits from that freed slave because the wala still technically belongs to them.
Okay, it all comes back to the mukatab finishing their kitabah.
Right. Only then can they fully exercise the rights that come with freeing someone.
What if the mukatab doesn't fully free their slave but gives them a kitabah instead?
In that case, the wala stays with the mukatab's master until the mukatab is fully free. Then the wala goes back to them.
So it's like a chain reaction.
Right.
The mukatab can't have full wala over others until their own master gives them full freedom.
Exactly. It shows the order of how wala is passed on in this system.
This whole concept of wala is fascinating. It adds another layer to this whole system.
It does. Islamic scholars really put a lot of thought into addressing all these different situations.
Now, the last section, what is not permitted in freeing a mukatab, talks about some of the limits on the master's power when it comes to freeing a mukatab, particularly in cases of joint ownership.
Right. This part focuses on fairness and responsibility when multiple mukatabs are involved.
Okay, so what exactly is the master not allowed to do?
If there are multiple slaves in a joint kitabah, the master can't free just one of them without the agreement of the others.
Makes sense. It wouldn't be fair to the others who are still working towards freedom.
Right. It could make things much harder for them.
So it's about protecting everyone in the kitabah.
Yes. It shows that they're all in this together.
Are there any exceptions to this rule?
Yes. The book says that a master can free elderly, exhausted, or very young mukatabs who can't contribute to the kitabah.
So it takes into account those who are especially vulnerable and might need extra care.
It's about being merciful even within a system that has its flaws.
Now we come to the final section. Bequests involving mukatabs. This seems to bring together a lot of the ideas we've been discussing.
It does. It's about how a master can free a mukatab in their will.
So even after death, a master can grant freedom.
Exactly.
How does that work? Does the mukatab automatically become free when the master dies?
Not quite. It's a bit more involved. When a master wants to free a mukatab in their will, the value of the mukatab is considered, and that amount is taken from the inheritance.
Okay.
But the amount used to free the mukatab can't be more than 1/3 of the total estate.
So it's like any other gift or donation in a will. It has limits.
Exactly. It's to make sure the heirs are treated fairly, too.
So let's say the mukatab is worth 1,000 dirhams and the estate is 3,000 dirhams.
Okay.
Would the full 1,000 be used to free them?
Yes. In that case, they would be freed because it's within that 1/3 limit.
But what if they're worth more than that?
Then freeing the mukatab takes priority over other things in the will.
Wow, so even if there's not enough in that 1/3 to fully cover their value, they're still freed.
Yes, and their kitabah is reduced by whatever amount was used from the inheritance.
The master's wish to free them, is that important?
It is.
What happens to the rest of the kitab amount?
The heirs can choose to pay it off themselves,
Okay.
or they can give the mukatab to the beneficiaries named in the will.
So those beneficiaries would then become the new masters, and
Exactly.
they would get the remaining kitaba payments.
Right. This whole section shows how the kitaba system connected to inheritance laws.
Yeah, it's amazing how much detail and thought went into creating this system.
It is. It shows a real effort to address all these different aspects of slavery, freedom, finance, and even death.
As we finish up this deep dive, I'm struck by how complex this whole institution was. It wasn't just about laws, but also about social norms and people's experiences.
I agree. It reminds us that history is complicated, and even within systems that we might find objectionable, there can be stories of compassion and people striving for a better life.
And for our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring this topic. Read the source material, look at other historical accounts, and maybe even think about how the themes of freedom, justice, and human dignity that we've talked about today connect to our world now.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.